As lawyers, tribunals have a time frame, isn't it? They have a specific time. So they were bound to end. But the violations of human rights were also bound to continue, ironically. Because rights are violated on a day-to-day basis, even in Uganda today, even in the United States, even in France. They are violated. So there was need for a prescription. And that's how the UDHR is crafted in 1948. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. I'm still talking about the historical progression of what we call rights. We started with philosophy, moved to religion. We are now looking at the historical progression, and we've reached the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. Now, that document has got a major weakness, that it's not binding on any state party. However, in the historic progression, it provided important raw data for future treaties and laws focusing on the protection of fundamental human rights. So that's why later on in 1966, you had the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, focusing on civil and political rights. The right to peacefully assemble, the right to demonstrate, the right to say what you want to say. When you read that document, it is heavily influenced by the UDHR of 1948. So you cannot denigrate the importance of the UDHR because it's not binding. It still plays a critical role in the fight for fundamental human rights. In the very same year, you had the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. Now this focusing on economic, social, and cultural rights, because sometimes in the developed economies, it is easier to promote civil and political rights, because you see, what the state has got to do to promote civil and political rights is simply to refrain from violating the rights, because history has shown us that the state is the biggest violator of rights. So the moment it refrains itself, most of the times the rights are protected. But with economic, social, and cultural rights, the state has got to dig deeper into the state national coffers to get money to ensure that your right to a decent meal is protected. We're talking about the right to adequate food. It's the duty of the state to ensure that you do not die of hunger. Uganda is a signatory to that document, 1966. We are looking at the historic progression. So, those historical events have informed our national laws, our international laws, our regional laws, aimed at promoting human rights. However, I have already told you that there is an age-old debate on whether human rights can be universal. The people who critique the universality of rights have argued for what they call cultural relativism. The position that moral propositions do not reflect objective and or universal moral truths, but instead make claims relative to social, cultural, historical, and personal circumstances. And sometimes they can be convincing, because our cultures are certainly different from the cultures in Asia, the cultures in Latin America, the cultures in Persia. So how can we have uniform set of values. Is it possible? It's an age-old debate. It's an age-old debate. Because of our cultural contexts, sometimes we tend to view things differently. What the West may consider universal norms in human rights may not be applicable in other cultures. Others have even argued that the so-called rights were developed in the West. For example, when you talk about the UDHR, and I have told you that it was crafted by the victors of the Second World War. We've talked about the early philosophers who lived thousands of years before Christ was born. They talked about the universality of those values. Some of these philosophers were from Asia. Others were from even the African continent. They talked about the universality of those values. So, it is my argument in this paper that human rights can be universal. However, it is important as we advance this argument of the universality of rights to appreciate that the basis of rights need not to have cultural or philosophical origins. So as you argue as a human rights lawyer, you ought to be well cognizant of the fact that rights do not start with the UDHR of 1948. Rights do not start with the historical developments we talked about. Secondly, as we talk about the universality of rights, it is important to know that all cultures have common histories of injustices. Demands for rights from oppressed populations often drive reform. So instead of looking at them as things crafted by the West, look at them as values aimed at addressing age-old injustices. And societies, whether in the West, whether in Asia, whether in Arabia, whether in Latin America, have for generations fought to end these injustices. So, when the basis of rights is presented in these terms, it becomes fundamentally clear that they should be universally applied. I thank you, ladies and gentlemen.